We're delighted to have this cooperation with the ISGAP and our friend Charles Small, who will introduce the work of the Institute and introduce the panel. I personally think anti-Semitism in Europe is a very, very important topic that needs to be understood, analyzed, and hopefully, with all our efforts, fought against. But I leave it to the expert to explore it in more detail. And it's a phenomenon that unfortunately we have in many European countries. You follow the news in Germany, in Britain, in Italy, wherever it is unfortunately part of reality in Europe, and it's a dangerous reality in my view, and I'm delighted to have this panel of experts who know much more about it, and that's all I need to say before passing it on to Charles, who will talk a little bit about the work of the Institute and introduce the panelists. Charles.
I'm really grateful and honored for Hartmut, to Professor Mayer, to have us here for this conversation, this panel discussion. ISGAP is a research center that does the interdisciplinary analysis of contemporary anti-Semitism. We're based in the United States, Canada, Italy at La Sapienza University, and we have an entity in Israel, and we actually just opened an entity in the United Kingdom as well. So we're international, we're a small research center, and one of the main things that we do research projects, but we also run a summer institute here at Oxford where we train scholars and help them create courses on contemporary anti-Semitism. We've been doing this for 5 years. We have over 220 graduates, and they're scholars from over 30 countries teaching courses for credits at their home university based on our summer program. And there was a real need for training professors on contemporary issues because it's not an issue that's really dealt with in the university. And I'm pleased to be with 3 amazing colleagues, and they all participate in different forums in the Summer Institute. That's how we all kind of came together. So on my right is Dina Lisnyansky. She's a professor at Tel Aviv University and at Ariel University. She's an expert on political Islam. Dr. Viera Žúborová, sorry for asking your name. She's from the Bratislava Institute, Policy Institute, and she just came here literally now from fresh elections. And Professor David Hirsh from Goldsmiths College in London, and an old colleague and friend of these efforts. So today we're speaking about globalization and anti-Semitism, and I'm going to try and set the context very briefly so that my colleagues who are experts on political Islam, the radical left and the radical right can get into what is taking place and the processes taking place in the European context. I'm going to speak very briefly, and please forgive me. I'll be brief on the history of anti-Semitism. I'll speak about the history of anti-Semitism in about 2 minutes, so please forgive me for being so brutal on it. But I'd say that there are 3 forms of anti-Semitism. There is a religious form of anti-Semitism, a racist form of anti-Semitism, and an attack on who Jews are as a people. And when the dominant perspective, the dominant worldview was through the lens of religion, the Jewish people were perceived as the quintessential other. And they did not accept the teachings of the Christian notion of the Messiah. They did not accept the teachings of the Messiah. And Christianity, particularly in Europe for irregular periods of times and variations, perceived that if the Jew did not accept the Christian notion of the Messiah, that they would not be able to have redemption. What makes anti-Semitism, according to Robert Wistrich and other important scholars on the field of anti-Semitism, what makes anti-Semitism unique and potentially, or inherently rather, genocidal, is this belief that the Jew had to be civilized. So it was not enough that the Jew was blinded by evil if they didn't accept the Christian notion of Messiah, and that they would be unable to obtain redemption. What the teachings in the church often taught was that the Jew, by not accepting the Christian notion of Messiah, was hindering world redemption. So with this force of civilizing the Jew, there you have forced conversions, exile, and pogroms. When the global dominant view shifted from religion to notions of race and nation and biologically determined notions of identities, the Jew suddenly found himself in the wrong place, or the wrong race, and the wrong nation. And the Jew was perceived as poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. And again, the work of Wistrach and David Nirenberg and others are very important in this field. But unlike the period of religion, there was no escaping the essentiality of race. The theology, the social sciences, the philosophy perceived race as something inherent into one's characteristic. You couldn't convert your race. It was inherent. And the Jews were poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race, and this type of anti-Semitism culminates ultimately in the Holocaust, the extermination of the entity of the race that was polluting the purity of the race and of the nation. Those forms of anti-Semitism, particularly in the academic world and academic circles, are things of the past. If people articulate sort of reactionary Christian views of the Jew or racist views of the Jew, I would argue that those types of anti-Semitisms have no real place and are not socially acceptable by and large in the academy or in the media of record. But today's anti-Semitism, the variations of anti-Semitisms, is an attack on who Jews are as a people. And I would submit to you that this type of delegitimization and degradation is not only acceptable, but it's actually encouraged. And I think today we will hear from people who will look at the types of anti-Semitisms that exist. So as Israel, as Jewish notions of peoplehood is delegitimized and demonized, I think many people would say that in a sense that they're not anti-Semitic, they're anti-Zionist. They're not anti-Israel, but they don't like the policies of Israel, which is fine. But the demonization and delegitimization of Jewish people as it relates to the Jewish notion of a homeland, as Israel becomes demonized, so do European Jewish communities. It's not just a problem that rested in the Middle East, but has migrated to Europe. So Jewish students on university campuses in Europe and now certainly in North America, Jewish people going to, and I think in particular Jewish faculty and students on campuses that are enlightened, progressive, postmodern, with Jewish students or faculty having strong Jewish identity and a connection to the Zionist entity. As the Zionist entity becomes demonized, it's apartheid, racist, colonial, pinkwashing, fascistic entity, young students and faculty with any affiliation to that entity become problematic. People walking to synagogues on European streets become problematic in many levels with this new contemporary form of anti-Semitism. And I did an article on this with Edward Kaplan at Yale University, and we interviewed 10,000 people in 10 European countries, and basically showed the correlation between what we call Israel bashing and classical forms of anti-Semitism. So both anti-Semitism and Israel bashing was relatively low, or lower than we assumed it would be in the 10 countries. But what we discovered, and what many people probably already know, is that those who are classically anti-Semitic, those who are considered Israel bashers, that they think Israel is an apartheid state, or the Israeli army intentionally shoots Palestinian children, or the Israelis are poisoning the water of Palestinians. Very sort of extreme pronouncements of Israel bashers. If they answered 5 in this criteria, they were considered Israel bashers. What we discovered is that Israel bashers were 13 times more likely to be anti-Semitic in the classical sense than the average population of the 10 European countries. So the correlation between Israel bashing and classical forms of anti-Semitism is strong. So there is a correlation. I'll just say very briefly too, philosophically, there's a connection, I think, as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. where Adorno famously said that there'd be no poetry after Auschwitz. And I think, in a sense, Horkheimer and Adorno's view of Enlightenment as invariably leading to Nazism, in a sense, that the distinction between civilization and barbarism was blurred in the final solution. Enlightenment in the reading contains the seeds of its own destruction, the eventual domination of the world through a reason that had been rendered fully instrumental in the service of the state, leading ultimately to genocide. For that is, for Adorno, the promise of Enlightenment freedom, which led to fascism and the death camps. And what, this, I'll be very brief, but in a sense, what has happened philosophically in the sort of postmodern moment is that the Jew, the ultimate victim of fascism and Nazism, has become symbolized, if you will, philosophically through the work of Said and Foucault of this postmodern moment, that the Zionist and the Jew has become the quintessential Nazi. And this is not just this rationale, this philosophical moment is not just in the Middle East Studies Department, but has become part of the philosophical, academic, and public discourse as well. So the flipping of this is very important and has deep roots in the academy and now is reflected in discourse. Now a brief word. There was an introduction to anti-Semitism, globalization. So globalization, if we look at issues of time-space compression, globalization are a series of economic, social, and political processes and cultural processes that bring people as close together perhaps as never before in the history of humanity, but it also is separating people. And time-space compression, David Harvey and Giddens and others use this, David Held, use this to understand the processes of globalization. So for those of us who are on the initiating side of globalization, globalization is a sense of freedom. Business, commerce, scholarship. We have a panel here, people are very international and global. In a globalized world, if you're fixed in time and space, if you're stuck in a ghetto or in a township or on illegal land, you're on the receiving end of neoliberal globalization and you're stuck in time and space. What is fascinating, and I've covered this in my research, to me what is fascinating is that neoliberalism tries to weaken the state, to weaken the state to allow economic and forces of the economy to help to develop the society and with that bring more freedom. That was the model. At the same time, political Islam, as we will hear later, also does not want the state to thrive. The political Islamists perceive the state as a vestige of Western imperialism and colonialism, and political Islam is out to destroy the vestiges of Western Christian imperialism. So you have neoliberalism and political Islam filling a vacuum that is being left. And this marginality and the vacuum has created a series of reactionary social movements. And what's interesting is that the political Islamists have incorporated anti-Semitism. We'll hear more about this, but the protocols of the Elders of Zion have basically been fused with political Islam, thanks to the beginning of the Muslim Brotherhood about 100 years ago, with people like alBanna and Kutub who took European anti-Semitism and even fascism and fused it with their notion of Islam and sort of gives rise to political Islam in the region. Also, with the rise of political Islam, states are collapsing. Syria, genocide. Does Syria really exist, or it's just enclaves of Shia, Sunni, and the Kurds? Do these entities still exist as the state is so weakened? Refugee crisis, rising nationalism in parts of Europe, using anti-Semitism. The Jews are behind the migration of refugees into Europe and into the United States of America. So Jews are being blamed there. And of course, we will hear David at the end speaking about the rise of kind of a reactionary left-wing anti-Semitism, kind of the Corbynization, if you will, of the left. And now we have Bernie Sanders, where Jewish peoplehood Zionism, those who are labeled as being a part of this project are now getting anti-Semitic rhetoric from the left, from the right, and from political Islam. And we have three amazing scholars who will go into each area and to continue the conversation. So first, Dina.
Thank you, Charles, for the introduction. It was basically the quintessence of what I'm going to speak about. So we're going to talk today about all kinds of modern anti-Semitism in Europe. And as you can see here on this board, you can see that according to reports that were focusing on 12 countries in between the years of 2012 and 2018, we have seen that anti-Semitism was rising more and more in Austria, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, as you can see, all the countries here, including the UK prior to Brexit. And around 90% of respondents to the European Union's Agency for Fundamental Rights, the FRA, questions in 2018 said they feel anti-Semitism is growing in their countries. Moreover, a similar number said that they experienced it online, while a very high number of 73%, as you can see, say it is evident in public spaces. And now a new report that is being written right now in these days says that since the last survey in 2018, in 2019, anti-Semitic attacks all over Europe has grown rapidly, in some countries up to 20%, and the UK is somewhere in the middle. So we're talking about a very rapid growth on that matter. And I'd like to attend to some of the things that Charles has said before. Why is it happening? First of all, because I'm going to be speaking about political Islam, I'd like to say that there are three components to what we call European anti-Semitism today. The first would be actually right-wing anti-Semitism. The second would be left-wing anti-Semitism. And the third is Islamic or Muslim anti-Semitism. What I want to say is that it's not essentially Islamic. It's actually political Islam anti-Semitism that was brought by two different waves. And I will present to you two cases that will show exactly how it happened during the last decades. So first of all, as you can see here, we see on this picture the Mufti Haj Amin alHusseini, who was a representative of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine and was sent there by Hassan alBanna. He wasn't sent there. He was he sent another person whom I'm going to talk about in just a second. So Hassan alBanna, who was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, decided to take the most interesting ideology of his time, and I'm using this word intentionally, in order to infuse it into the new revival of the Muslim ideology. What I'm saying right now, I'm basing on the Saudi government's accusations that were published just a few weeks ago in the Saudi newspaper Okaz, and the article that was published was named The Nazi Brotherhood. And according to this article, we know that the founder of the movement, Hassan alBanna, had close ties with Adolf Hitler during the World War II and prior to that. And his counterpart, Haj Amin alHusseini, he actually met, as you can see, with Hitler. And not only that, later on, you will see that Haj Amin alHusseini was saluting to the 13th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Handschar, which is the first Croatian Muslim division. They were the only, or one of the only Muslim divisions during the World War II. So again, in Okaz newspaper, we can see that according to this article, alBanna served the Nazis in order to advance the Muslim Brotherhood political goals, which was very important to him, while alHusseini was connecting between both parties. So alHusseini was some kind of a liaison between Hassan alBanna and the Nazi party in Germany. This article also mentioned that the two served as spies for the Third Reich while collaborating with the British intelligence, as well as recruiting soldiers. But I'm not sure that this information is entirely true. I'm just quoting from this article. Again, this is also a part of the article. Hassan alBanna, as you can see him, with a Nazi symbol with a swastika on his hat. Another quote from this particular article is very important, I think. It says that Hassan alBanna maintained secret ties with several foreign intelligence apparatuses with the aim of gaining support for his political agendas, of taking power in Egypt, which is true, increasing the scope of his influence and realizing his political ambitions as part of the plan to establish the Muslim Brotherhood as the Islamic leadership of the world. This is stated in the article, again true according to other sources. So let's talk a little bit about the Muslim Brotherhood ideology because it's very important for us. First of all, the Muslim Brotherhood was not supposed to be an anti-Semitic movement or to obtain any kind of anti-Semitic ideology. The Muslim Brotherhood was supposed to be a mere reaction to the British occupation of Egypt. That's it. The Muslim Brotherhood was just a revival movement struggling with occupation. That is all. What has actually happened was that the fact that it was based on more than just religious Islamic principles. It was also based on two basic foundations that were more foreign foundations. The first, it was founded as a social, religious, and political movement as a reaction, as I said, to the Western influence in the Middle East and in the Arab world. And the second notion is that it regards the state of Israel as an extension of this foreign Western influence. Hence, it needs to be either eliminated or, well, they need to fight with it. But the thing is that it didn't only remain within the frame of fighting the state of Israel. And as you, Charles, have stated before, all Jews became representatives of the state of Israel for the Muslim Brotherhood. We saw it first in 1948 when Hassan alBanna started inciting the masses in Egypt against Egyptian Jewry in Cairo and Alexandria. It was against King Farouk's policy. King Farouk was the king of Egypt during this time. What happened after that was just initially a very different, let's say, a very different case of Muslim Brotherhood ideology that came to Europe. It became mainstream when in Egypt the Muslim Brotherhood was banned, and it was banned several times, but for the first time it was banned in the 1950s, and during the 1960s it was banned as well. Then the Muslim Brotherhood refugees had to find some other place. Some of them came to Europe. One of them was alBanna's son-in-law, Sayyid Ramadan, and this is exactly the person whom I said, who I was talking about earlier. He emerged as a major leader of the Brotherhood and became the movement's unofficial foreign minister. Ramadan built a significant center for the Brotherhood in Munich. I believe his son is still teaching here in St. Antony's College, by the way. And in 1989, what has actually happened was a new thing, and the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe, another, Muslim Brotherhood affiliated umbrella organization, it was funded by the Muslim Brotherhood in Brussels. So with main office in Brussels, the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe became an umbrella-like organization and represented more than 1,000 local groups of 29 Muslim organizations on the one hand, and 1,000 or more than 1,000 local groups under these 29 organizations on the other hand. Most of them are linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. And now we're going to jump to the 21st century, because in 2014, in April, the UK Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, commissioned an internal review of Muslim Brotherhood affiliated organizations within the UK. He wanted to understand more its origins, ideology, to find records about it and the way it was affiliated with charities within the UK and abroad. And I'm going to quote from this particular report that was issued in 2015. The Muslim Brotherhood organizations in the UK, including charities, are connected to counterparts elsewhere in Europe. MAB, Muslim Association of Britain, are associated with the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe, established by the Muslim Brotherhood in 1989. The FIOE subsequently created the European Council for Fatwa and Research. I'm going to tell about it just in a bit. It's another pan-European Muslim Brotherhood body intended to provide religious and social guidance to Muslims living in Europe. Here we can see that the European Council for Fatwa and Research was supposed to be a very helpful body, religious body, that helps issuing fatwas for Muslim minorities within Europe, which is a very important job because there were a lot of Muslim minorities and a lot of communities that didn't know what to do in certain cases, being, again, the first Muslim minority in their countries, in European countries. So they needed fatwas, legal rulings, like where am I supposed to pray? I'm just giving you an example. If I'm working in a whole non-Muslim office and I need to pray 5 times a day, what am I going to do? Or questions regarding legacy and questions regarding personal issues like raising children and getting married and how to behave with non-Muslims. All of these important issues were supposed to be attended by the, you see ECFR. They are attended, by the way. But the problem is that the founder of this ECFR was a person named Sheikh Yusuf al Qaradawi, who is now, by the way, considered to be one of the most important leaders, if not the most important leader, of the Muslim Brotherhood, of the global Muslim Brotherhood. So Yusuf al Qaradawi has very interesting views on Jews. And as you can see here, I'm quoting him, they are so corrupted that only Hitler managed to restrict their deeds. And next time, as Qaradawi sees it, next time, God willing, it will be done at the hands of the faithful believers, meaning Muslims. Many European Muslims not just condemn what Qaradawi has said, but most of the Muslim communities in Europe are in fact opposing strongly to Qaradawi's views, and they're suffering mostly from a problem of, as you see, a horrible image sometimes due to these kinds of sayings, but not only because of that. And this is the time for me to show you the second case that will explain why political Islam is so important when we speak about European anti-Semitism. The thing is that not just the Muslim Brotherhood was infiltrating those views within the Muslim communities that never intended to be anti-Semitic, of course. The problem is that these views are coming from the Middle East. And as you can see, they keep coming because the fifth wave of the Syrian refugees that is coming right now and that has already come to Europe gives us a very good example. I'm going to give you an example, and I will quote Rowan Osman, who is a Syrian native who lives in Strasbourg right now. He is talking about Syrians who reside in Germany. He says that the influence of anti-Semitism is most overtly visible in Syria's foreign policy. The Baathist regime that has been as you can see, supporting terrorist organizations such as Hamas and Hezbollah that target Israeli civilians. And on the other hand, they have official school books in Syria that are filled with anti-Semitic views. For instance, this is a quote from a book about Islamic education for 6th grade. It says, the Jews are treacherous and the deception and treason are part of the Jews' attributes. It says also that the violation of treaties and breaching promises are part of the Jewish nature. As far as Rowan Osman's study reveals, Syrians, and the same, I'm talking not just about the regime, also Syrians that are coming from Syria right now, they cannot just disconnect with what they were infiltrated for all these times. And we can see good examples of this even here, when very anti-Semitic sayings, very anti-Semitic hadiths are sayings of Prophet Muhammad, are being quoted in France and Germany and the UK within mosques, as you can see here. There is Imam Muhammad Attai. He is a formerly Imam of the Mosque Nur in Toulouse and currently Imam of the new Grand Mosque of Toulouse. In 2017, he's been quoting a hadith that says that the day of resurrection, which is like the most important day, right, of the apocalyptic view of the world, will come. When the day of resurrection comes, it will only happen after the tree and the rock will tell the Muslims that the Jews are hiding behind them. And they will say, "O Muslim, O slave of Allah, please come and kill the Jew who is hiding behind me." So these kinds of hadiths are still quoted in European mosques today. Another, and I think the last example that I will show you that has been brought here, again with refugees from Syria, is an example of the way the Jews are trying to, conquer the world again and to take everybody's resources. As you can see here, this is a very popular Syrian series of 29 episodes called Ashutosh, the Diaspora. And the writers, along with some of the Syria's most prominent actors, delivered an appalling compilation of anti-Semitic canards and libels, presenting Jews as the most wicked and immoral people on earth. As you can see, this is Rothschild. He is dying in the series, and he says to drown each of the countries of Europe in blood and massacres. This is his final wish. This is the main theme of Ashutosh series. As you can see, the Star of David with blood all over it. These are titles. And the last thing that I want to tell you is actually Roman Osman's testimonial. He says that in his opinion, while the German government has vowed to combat anti-Semitism, as a Syrian, he knows that warnings alone are not enough to counter decades of anti-Semitic messaging, and in the febrile minds of extreme anti-Semites, attacking Jews can be seen as an honorable and courageous act. He, of course, means some of the refugees that are now doing these acts. We can see that these individuals have been conditioned since birth to perceive the Jewish people as their enemy. Of course, again, I'm talking about individuals, not about everybody, but we are talking about a mindset. And here are the conclusions. Muslim anti-Semitism in Europe is deeply influenced by the old mindset the new refugees and immigrants bring from their homelands. This mindset interacts with local forms of anti-Semitism that include old European anti-Semitic beliefs, new anti-Zionist mindset fueled by BDS organizations, and a mix of the two that is being cooked by local European MB-related organizations. All of these form a new wave of anti-Semitism among European Muslims, and hence they serve as a refuel to the old European forms of Jew hatred. Again, please don't get me wrong, I'm talking about a very certain part, a very small part, a very small percent among the Muslim communities. Most of the Muslim communities oppose this and they suffer from it almost as much as the Jews, sometimes more, it depends where. But for this part, I must tell you that this is a real problem, and levels of anti-Semitism are only going to rise because of this. Thank you.
Viera.
My presentation will be focusing mainly on our project that is funded by European Commission, and it's called COMMENS. It's called Combat Antisemitism in Central Europe. And we are lately analyzing the huge amount of the data that we have, up to 4,000 respondents were gathering from the Facebook, and up to 40 questions were raised there. So we have a really huge amount of data that we need to go through it. But right now I would like to present you just a little insight. If we are, for example, we as Central European society differs from the western part of Europe, or the globalization have impact on the anti-Semitism in our region. Let me go briefly. I call globalization as a good start, because I think that the internet, especially social media, have a great impact on the behavior, not only in the online sphere, but also in the offline world towards societies. The social media are able to shape the reality and also shape the beliefs and attitudes toward any kind of minority, especially in our region, Jews, LGBT community, Roma community, and also Black people. So our main focus was to gather the data on the attitudes of the Jews, but also on the others, because this is the political discourse that are already running in the Central Europe. And we was a little bit lucky, because when we applied for the grant, it was that time when Viktor Orban and Robert Fico as the prime minister started talking about George Soros. So we were lucky that time, so we get the grant to analyze anti-Semitic hate speech in Central Europe. So I would like to share you the global trends. Dina already mentioned some of them. The latest report reflects not little change in the Western Europe, but a huge change in the Central Eastern Europe that shows an increased amount of anti-Semitic hate speech, beliefs, and attitudes. And our main purpose was to look on the users, daily users of the Facebook, if they are anti-Semitic, and what are their beliefs and what are their attitudes, and how they are able to shape the reality of the political and societal discourse in our countries. So this was the main aim, and also we would like to somehow mirror the trends that are global to our region. If we are mirroring the beliefs, the content, also the topics that cause or awake the most anti-Semitic hate speech in Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. I think all of you heard about Viktor Orban, about Hungary, about Poland, but I think not all of you know about Slovakia and Czech Republic, about the anti-Semitism that is deeply rooted in the society, and it's deeply rooted because of the historical events, especially Tiso's regime. That was the regimes under or the Tiso was a priest who collaborated with Hitler's, and it became the first fascist state in the Central Europe, in the middle of Slovakia. The Central European trends, they are most related to, let's call it, the societies there are really insecure in their beliefs towards the future, towards the political system. They have an unstable national identity, and everything what for them means otherness, it's the enemy of the state. And the Jews are not the expectations. So they have prejudice against historical minorities, especially in Slovakia, about Jews and about Roma. The same goes with Hungary and Czech Republic. We thought that Poland could mirror our beliefs and attitudes, but they are different. They completely differ from other Central European countries. And I would like to tell you why. This is our project, Combat Antisemitism in Central Europe, and we are at the beginning of the first phase that we conduct online survey with the Facebook users, and you see the amount of the questionnaires that we raise. Right now we are at the beginning of the second phase. It's content analysis of the media, especially the alternative media and the mainstream media, how they are able to struggle with the anti-Semitic content, and what are the comments under the anti-Semitic news. And last but not least, we would like to conduct focus groups, especially with the experts on anti-Semitism and media content, but also focus groups in that regions where we are able to tackle down anti-Semitic behavior or radical behavior, especially far-right radical behavior. For example, in Slovakia, it's the middle region of the Slovakia, where this is a paradox where the Nazis shoot the Jews. Almost all of them were shot in the middle of our region. The insight the thesis was that the online, or especially social media, tend to polarize the societies, not on the online sphere, but also in the offline world, tend to the humanization of the Jews and normalization of the content. Because right now, from my personal view, when I was reading the content comments under the news, you are reading so many hate that you are normalized. You think it's just normal that somebody told you are a Jew and you will be killed. I got lots of emails because I'm talking too much at the media sphere in Slovakia, and the usual email started with you should be banned from the media because you are a Jew. And I'm not officially, but okay. For example, another example, Slovak President Zuzana Čaputová was dehumanized with the alternative media because they put them a Jewish nose and the main cover before the presidential election. She won, but still, you know the saying or the jokes, the bad mood is still there. Everybody's talking about her that she's a Jew and she's not. She's properly Catholic, believe me. The rise of anti-Semitic content and this is something that worries me a lot in our region, Latin antisemites. And I would like to talk about these Latin antisemites because it's a huge population in the societies of Central Europe who just waiting for any kind of crisis, migration crisis again, or any economic crisis, to be more official anti-Semites, not only Latin. So we went through the categorization. I would like to skip it because we went, this is the phase of content analysis. We would like to focus on the anti-Semitism according to type, the target especially in Central Europe, George Soros, according to ideology in Central Europe, far right, according to the context, especially in Central Europe, conspiracy theories, according to the media. Also, right now, mainstream media are publishing anti-Semitic content, even that they don't know it. And this is the crucial thing. The main problem, I think, it's the consumption of the anti-Semitic hate speech or the consumption of anti-Semitic content. And usually there is a strong tendency with various types of anti-Semitic stereotypes, especially the traditional one, the greediness of the Jews, the Jews that are ruling the world, the Jews that are the masterminds behind the migration crisis. There are the Jews that are stealing our tradition. This is a nationalistic tendency. And the main problem, if you can see, these are the numbers for all Visegrad countries or Central European countries. For example, the stereotype on ethnocentrism is slightly more than 51%. They tend to believe it. Also about the world domination, about towards intolerance, that Jews are not tolerant towards any other minorities or majority where they are living. And again, greediness. These are the most classical stereotypes at the online sphere in these countries. Not a new anti-Semitism, but all rooted stereotypes that are becoming more and more visible in the social media. Consumption and emotion. We also ask the respondents about the topics or events that cause or awake the most negative emotion towards Jews. The first insight was that Poland was completely different. Slovakia, Hungary, they were mirroring themselves as societies, and the most topic was migration crisis that caused the most negative emotion toward Jews. Then Soros and his officially or unofficially funding of NGOs in our countries. In Czech Republic, also migration crisis and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how the Jews are dealing with Palestine. Poland differs a lot. The most topic that awake negative emotion were Jewish anniversaries or holidays, historical buildings, especially cemeteries, and the behavior of Jews towards Poles. It was completely different discourse in Poland than in these countries. And let me tell you why I think this differ, because of our historical past. Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary were under Austro-Hungarian monarchy. and we carry the same cultural code with us for longer decades. Poles were different in their tradition, different in their culture, and also different because right now we are officially members of the European Union, but still Poles are, and believe me, but they force to say no, they are in their culture more Russian than Europeans. This is the paradox.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of poets coming from Poland and Russia, and they have this fight who was the nationality of these poets. And last but not least, this is the consumption and emotion. If you see the migration crisis cause really or awake the most negative emotion towards Jews. I'm really looking forward what we have through the content analysis of the media and also from the focus groups. Support of Soros, it's the most, I think, the most visible in Slovakia after the migration crisis and after the election in 2016. It was the former Prime Minister Robert Fico who said after the killing of journalist Jan Kuciak and Martina Kušnírova, his fiancée, that everything was managed by Soros. Also the death of the journalist. The Prime Minister, publicly, through all the mainstream television said it. Yeah, he resigned, but still, he said it, and at that moment, all the conspiracy theories started to bubbling at the online sphere. The most crucial thing from the research was that we have a huge amount of latent antisemites. You can see the numbers, especially the right one. Majority of respondents in the V4 countries are placed themselves in a neutral position towards attitudes about Jews. But the second question was about the classical stereotypes, and the most answers were from the latent antisemites. This is the main problem. Not that we have often minded people or people who are openly speaking about anti-Semitic conspiracies, but we have people who think that but stay very neutral and waiting for their crisis. And then this could go more nasty, because this is the famous quote that everything starts with a Jew but not end with the Jews. Any other minorities will come up. And this is the main, for example, in Slovakia, the most negative emotion are towards LGBT community and Roma. And then Jews. We like our Jews, up to 20% of respondents like Jews in Slovakia, because nobody is seeing a Jew, because we were killing them up. I think 60,000 Jews were transported to Auschwitz from Slovakia under the decarceration. And right now we have 1,000 Jews in Bratislava and Košice. So, and this is I think this is something that I don't know what to do about this latent anti-Semitism. And okay, and what we should do with it? The main problem in Central Europe is that we don't have any education that focus on critical thinking and on emotional thinking. Because what we learned from the research was that all of these societies were emotional. And if we are not able to somehow to go in this emotion and change the discourse, we are lost as a societies. And this is the only way how we can deal, not in Europe, not maybe in global, but in our region with emotion. We need to play again the emotional card, but in a positive way. This is the only way how we can deal with it. And also insecurity. 80% of Slovaks are insecure. And this is mean that they are somehow anti-Semitic, xenophobic, anti-liberal. And I think the last but not least, that anti-Semitism mirror the attitudes toward liberal democracy in our region, especially in Slovakia. For example, if I'm a liberal voter, when I was on Saturday, when I was in the electional room, a lot of people tend to think about me that I'm also a Jew because I'm a liberal one. It's a correlation, you know. And this is the main problem.
Explain that again.
That anti-Semitism and illiberalism are the same in our region. If you are a liberal, you are a Jew. And this is the main problem. And we saw it on the results of the Saturday election again. Far-right populists won the election. Fascists became the 5th strongest parliamentary party. And no liberal entered to the parliament. Only one. But they are promoting only economic liberalism, not the political one. And this is the main problem. And I think this is also the result of political discourse that was becoming more stronger because the official politicians started to talk anti-Semitic hate speech. So these are our thoughts from the survey. And hopefully with the emotional education and maybe with the culture, because this, I think cultural institutions are the most sensitive one that are able to talk about the history. We will be lucky and we will somehow to skip the Latin anti-Semitism and to become a normal region in the Europe. Thank you.
What we got from both of those talks, I think, is that movements against democracy and democratic thinking and against the democratic state are attracted by anti-Semitism. And it seems to me likely that anti-Semitism is a form of appearance of anti-democratic politics. And it seems to me to be likely also that every anti-democratic movement is going to be tempted by anti-Semitism. Whether that really happens or not is another question, is a question for history, but there is something tempting for anti-democratic politics about anti-Semitism, and I want to try and look at how and why that is, with a focus actually on democratic Western Europe, really, which has something in common with what we've just been talking about. So I want to think of my book came out in 2018, was a kind of history of 20 years of the mainstreaming of left anti-Semitism from the very fringes of Stalinist and Trotskyist politics, where I used to hang out, into the mainstream, into the Labour Party, into the unions, into the leader of the opposition's office, and into the general election. And that mainstreaming, I think, is something that we have not only seen on the left, but we've also seen on the right, with a mainstreaming of debates which previously were not really happening, about foreigners, about immigration, about foreigners taking over our country and taking away our sovereignty and taking away our jobs, and all of those discourses. So I want to ask, really, whether there is something that we can capture as perhaps populism. And I don't know if populism is a great word, but it's the word we have, really. What is it that we have that is in common between the mainstreaming of the anti-democratic left and the mainstreaming of the anti-democratic right? And if they weren't mainstreaming, who would care, right? If they weren't moving into the mainstream, into the government, into mainstream discourse, it would be much less important and much less interesting. But there is a phenomenon that we need to explain. So the liberal democratic state, in theory, was a complex set of institutions and ideas and cultures which mediated the vast diversity of human beings, of citizens. So people from different classes and of different genders and of different origins and races and with different tastes and different interests were all mediated through freedom of speech, through the structures of the state, through the liberty of civil society, through the organizations which they themselves were free to build in the democratic state, and then they would come together as citizens and try to think in the universal interest and to create laws and to create not only the limits of individual and group freedom, but also to guarantee civil society, which was the sphere of freedom for human beings. And it seems to me that in a very shorthand way, we can look at populism as a critique of that liberal democratic culture and that liberal democratic state. And that liberal democratic complexity, because the world as it exists, as it developed, as the state developed, as civil society developed, is complex. And there are kind of countless millions and millions of ways in which people's interests and tastes are mediated through the state. And what populism does is it tries to simplify. And it says, firstly, that this idea that I've just presented of the liberal democratic state is fundamentally a fiction. That the liberal democratic state is fake. The liberal democratic state pretends to be nice, and it pretends to be in everybody's interests, and it pretends to be multicultural and in favour of liberty, but really it is controlled by an elite or an establishment or some kind of secret liberal or neoliberal coterie. And what that means is that we are deceived. Ordinary citizens are deceived every moment of our lives by all of these apparently official liberal institutions. We're deceived by the press. We're deceived by Parliament. We're deceived by the law, because really they are all organs of the liberal elite establishment, which is there to do us down. Now, having said that, so what populism does is it sort of takes a very complex world and makes it much, much simpler. It takes the people and it finds their enemies in all of these different places where we thought there were friends, in freedom of speech, in democratic politics, in self-organisation, in the churches, in the trade unions. And so populism makes everything simpler, and it divides everything into the people and the enemies of the people. But whereas the democratic liberal model was a huge machine for mediating complex diversity, the populist model is much simpler, because while it gives you this idea of the people whose interests we must be in favour of, it doesn't allow the people any way in which they can speak for themselves. So the populist model of the people gives you a strongman leader who is, and then the sort of strongmen compete for who is going to talk with the voice of the people. And that's that's my kind of thesis or hypothesis, really. And of course, immediately you can knock it down. You can say, look, you say that the liberal democratic state is complex and we have to resist all these simple dichotomies between the liberal establishment and the people, or the 1% and the 99%, or the cosmopolitans and the people of somewhere. But aren't you doing the same thing by dividing the world into populism and anti-populism? So, of course, that is one of the problems that we already begin with, is that complexity is complex. And yet, to understand the world, we need to simplify. So there is a slippage always between a kind of complex and true view of the world based on facts, based on statistics, based on observation, and the way in which those empirical ways of thinking about the world are kind of slipped into a single dominating ideology. One of the examples was from Dina. I think Dina kept on saying, and rightly so, that this problem of anti-Semitism is not about Muslims or Islam in general, but it's about particular kinds of political formations which mobilize anti-Semitism using an Islamist narrative. And she said it 3 times. And of course, there are people, you know, in the watching on the TV who don't believe her, who say, well, you say that, but. And there's always this ability to take a complex situation and distill it. And of course, we see that with the distinction between criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. We see people sort of insisting to their last breath, I don't hate Jews, I just hate Zionism and I just hate Israel. But we know that there's some slippage has gone on in that insistence. So just to say, really, I'm aware that dividing the world into populism and anti-populism is already a kind of a priori problematic way to think about the world. So I've been looking at David Goodhart because I think David Goodhart gives a really compelling understanding, in Britain anyway, of, if you like, the new world. And what he does is he divides the world into anywheres and somewheres. So again, a kind of simple distinction. And he says this is the new cultural divide, and this can explain Brexit, and this can explain Trump, and this can explain the revolts of the working class against the liberal establishment. He says anywheres are mainly graduates and affluent. We're less than a quarter of the population, but we dominate politics and society. I was really interested in the way he uses the term we, actually, because we've seen that too. We've seen that time and time again, is a kind of liberal confidence with its own values, with its own self, with its own culture, and a kind of over-willingness to take on the blame for everything bad that happens. The kind of quintessential way of explaining that is from Annie Hall, from Woody Allen, when his wife says to him, I sacked the maid because she was stealing from us, and he says, the maid is a black woman from Harlem. If she doesn't steal from us, who should she steal from? So this kind of incorporation of how bad we are is quite interesting, even in David Goodhart. So he gives 4 examples. Knowledge economy. And he says, again, really interestingly, designed for the educated. The knowledge economy has been designed for the educated. And if you really think that through, then we're already at the borders, I think, of something which also defines populism really, really clearly, which is a kind of openness to conspiracy theory. Because it seems to me that the knowledge economy wasn't designed, but it appeared, and we should take that seriously. But he's making a thesis, right? So let's go with his thesis. Universities favoured over vocational training. We put our children in universities because we like universities, and those children don't get trained to be plumbers and electricians and the rest of it. And that's why Britain is so open to people from Poland and Romania coming and fixing our pipes and our electrics. Of course, that's kind of true, right? It's true that in Britain, vocational training has been really bad. But what we do here is we take one truth and we put it into a big narrative. And the big narrative that we put it into is this cultural divide between anywheres and somewheres. The third one, we ignored or labelled as xenophobic the discomfort that many people felt over rapid ethnic change. And it's really, really interesting that he just says with confidence, and he articulates in a way that seems reasonable, the problem of the rise in xenophobia and the problem of people's willingness to be sort of communal and inward-looking and fearful of what he calls ethnic change. And then for anti-domesticity family policy. And he says that even though a kind of liberal, individualist, neoliberal, market-orientated feminism has allowed certain middle-class women to have the lives that they wanted to have, he says it hasn't really done anything about the decline of the traditional family. So this liberal policy of feminism has really only benefited the liberal elite. So again, the idea that the liberal elite or the establishment is doing things only for its own benefit, but pretending that it's for the universal benefit. David Goodhart says, we anywheres care about the world, but we can be guilty of a kind of self-regard and a naive liberalism too. Well, for sure, that must be true, right? Nobody's going to argue with that. But as a way of understanding, you know, the whole world and the changes that came about with Brexit and with Trump and the rest of it and with Marine Le Pen, maybe not. We're wary of most group identities because we just don't feel them ourselves. And I wonder if that's true. Because there is a worrying angle to this. And the worrying angle is that we, the liberal elite, are somehow only selfish, only care about profits, only care about reason, a kind of like the Horkheimer explanation for Auschwitz, or the Bauman explanation for Auschwitz, or the Heidegger explanation for Auschwitz. We, the liberal elite, are only care about ourselves. Rationality is only a tool to bolster the power of the powerful. But it's not chauvinistic to value your national identity, and it's not racist to feel more comfortable amongst people like yourself. Where have we heard that before, actually? Because the truth is, if you look at that sentence, it might be chauvinistic to value your national identity, depending on how you value your national identity. It's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. Well, it might be, depending on what kinds of criticisms you make of Israel. It's not racist to say that Muslims are anti-Semitic. Well, it might be, depending on what you say and how you say it. So again, a really quick slip. It's not chauvinistic to value your national identity, and it's not racist to feel more comfortable amongst people like yourself. But we know that we are a diverse country and a diverse universe in which people are like ourselves and unlike ourselves in whole diverse ways. And then he says, we anywheres have ruled in our own interests and called it the national interest. So a really clear, easy way of explaining on the 23rd of June, the Brexit vote, the somewheres said enough. And this was articulated by Theresa May, who said today, too many people, goodness me, I haven't even started. 5 minutes. Too many people in positions of power behave as though they have more in common with international elites than with the people down the road, the people they employ, the people they pass on the street. So again, this idea that the international liberal establishment and elite is individualist, only cares about itself, doesn't care about people around them on the street, in their factories, doesn't care about anything. This idea that the money nexus, neoliberalism, is only about rationality in a very instrumental, narrow sense. But if you believe you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. Huh? That was bold, wasn't it? If you believe you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere, you don't understand what citizenship means. Now, it seems to me that these are complex questions about what it means to be liberal, what it means to have civil society in which you can create your own structures and your own friendships and your own love and your own families and your own trade unions and churches and clubs and culture and movies and theatres and the rest of it. And to say, well, the people who are for that kind of liberal state are only for themselves, but the people who understand their rootedness in the soil, they're the decent people, and they've had it too hard for too long. Now, you will see, and I don't have much time, but you will see that, and I'm not saying Goodhart or Theresa May or anyone else is anti-Semitic, but you can see the resonance of anti-Semitic discourse in this whole idea of the people of nowhere and the people of somewhere, and I will ram it home because I do that. This is a quote from Adolf Hitler himself. The clique, people who are at home both nowhere and everywhere, who do not have anywhere a soil in which they have grown up, but who live in Berlin today, in Brussels tomorrow, Paris the day after that, and then again in Prague or Vienna or London, and who feel at home everywhere. So let's stand back really and just think about these easy combinations of people and enemy of the people. This is a photograph taken today on the borders of Europe. Britain is not our problem anymore, hooray. You know, what happens to Turkey and Greece, nothing to do with us, we're fine. We're carbon neutral, we're, you know, no problem. But this issue, this picture, which represents the fact that in huge parts of the world, life is unlivable because they do not have liberal democratic states which protect their right to live properly. And you cannot deal with this picture or explain this picture with a simple kind of, you know, anywheres or nowheres, or what are these people? Are these people anywheres, or are they somewheres, or are they nowhere? You know, in Hannah Arendt, they're nowhere. And I was going, if I had another 2 hours, I would go on to talk about Hannah Arendt's theory of totalitarianism, and the importance for her were the people who were squeezed out of being anywhere at all, not nowhere or somewhere, but not citizens. And the ways in which the ideas of nation, well, it's not racist to care about your own nation. Well, it's not until it is. So let me leave you, that was really the very beginning of what I wanted to say. Let me leave you with this from Hannah Arendt, or maybe just one more slide too, if you'll let me. She says, totalitarianism begins in contempt for what you have. Contempt for that liberal democratic state which doesn't work properly, which doesn't really, you know, it fails in every kind of way, as Winston Churchill say, except that there's nothing better. Things must change. No matter how, anything is better than what we have. Totalitarian rulers organize this kind of mass sentiment, and by organizing it, articulate it, and by articulating it, make the people somehow love it. And that's the danger, I think. And I will just steal a little more time, because I think these 6 characteristics of totalitarianism, which Hannah Arendt outlines, are really resonant with what's happening today, both on the left and on the right, both in Eastern and Western Europe, in the United States, elsewhere, and certainly also amongst the Islamist movements and other fundamentalist movements. It's a global movement, not only simply nationalist, but also universal. And we can see that in different ways, in different manifestations. And anti-Semitism provides an ideal organizing principle. Why? Because anti-Semitism has evolved over many very different instantiations throughout history of Jew hatred as a way of picturing this elite that lies to us and exploits us and runs the state and does all of those things. I'm nearly done. There's also an ultra-radical critique, not really a critique of rights, of law, of democracy, of bourgeois culture, but a kind of contempt for it. The stuff that we don't like, it's not just wrong. We don't just have a critique to make it better, but we take it down. Human rights, take it down. The European Union, take it down. the nation, take it down. So a kind of ultra-radical contempt for democracy and for the state, and also the idea of the new man, which I could talk about for a while too, but I won't. And then the essentialization of ideology. You take things that are true and you essentialize them into narratives which are true without statistics or facts or analysis or empirical data. And then, because you've destroyed all of the ways in which people can actually talk, you have the strong man who talks on behalf of the people.
Maybe about the Holocaust denial, it is really common right now, and we are not able to measure it because it's so common. This is the most pessimistic view of the survey. About the free speech, I was last week on a discussion panel with my colleague on hate speech, hate crime in Central Europe in Budapest, the last liberal standing city in Hungary, and they were talking about total war of ideas on the internet. That we, the thinkers, the scholars, the educated people needs to become the soldiers of this total war, because if we rely on the critical thinking on our younger generation, then we are losing the battle. Because right now the younger generation is more or less seeing in Central Europe like the generation of, I don't know if you know the term Swedish table, that you are able to pick everything from it up. And our younger generation is like that. They pick fascism, they pick far right, liberalism, neoliberalism, and they taste it. And this is the way why Kotlebas, the fascist party came up in Slovakia after the parliamentary election, because they would like to taste it, how it tastes. So this is my reply.
I'd like to add, if you may, regarding Holocaust denial in the Arab society and in the Muslim society, it's something of a given. There is something so obvious that we don't even mention it, because even though Qaradawi is speaking about Hitler, this is very interesting because it's opposed to Holocaust denial, right? Yeah. And he said in the movie, by the way, I don't know if you've seen, if you've noticed, he said that the Jews have made more of it than what it was, but it actually happened. Why did he need to say that it actually happened? Because he knows that his listeners who speak Arabic, they don't know that Holocaust actually happened, because it's denied in all school books as well. And sorry, just one last thing. And actually, it comes here to Europe because of, again, the political Islam antisemitism.
So I want to respond on a positive note. So I think it's what's interesting, the Muslim World League, which is the largest Sunni Islamic organization, which was run by Qaradawi until about 3 years ago. He was removed and replaced by Dr. Muhammad Alisa, who went to Auschwitz on the 75th anniversary just a few weeks ago. And he brought leading clerics with him. And it's fascinating. So I think, in a sense, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is being squeezed by the Muslim Brotherhood and by the Iranian revolutionary regime. And they are, I think, desperate for Western and even Israeli support. And something is happening. So there's more education about Holocaust and fighting Holocaust denial, because they see the extremism of the Muslim Brotherhood in Iran as a threat. And things are becoming a little bit more fluid on that front, which I find fascinating. I think it's too early to see if it's real and deep, but there's something happening. And maybe the beginning of an anti-extremist / fighting anti-Semitism, because I see, as Elie Wiesel said, anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. And I think the reactionary forces in places like Syria, 700,000 refugees since December, these reactionary movements are just running amok, using anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism as a fuel to kill their own brothers and sisters. There's a reaction happening, and hopefully it will have legs. And I think on free speech, it's a huge issue, but just very briefly, I think the First Amendment in the United States is really an issue in this age of social media and instant communication, a lot of anti-democratic foreign forces are basing their URLs, their domains in the United States, and they're protected by the First Amendment. So you have reactionary, racist, anti-Semitic, anti-democratic actors basing their social media in the United States, and they're enjoying the First Amendment rights. So that's a huge issue that needs to somehow be dealt with. It's complicated.
The thing is that we should take into consideration what is considered to be an act of anti-Semitism, first of all. What kind of incident is anti-Semitic? Some things we can say very easily, we can differ them and specificate that people who are saying, "You dirty Jew," while somebody's walking on the street and obviously is Jewish, well, this is an anti-Semitic incident, right? No arguing that one. Okay. So the perception of anti-Semitism on the rise, you're saying that it's not on the rise, you're saying it's flat, right? But the thing is, maybe, I don't know, maybe people are reporting more.
Yes.
Maybe they're aware more of anti-Semitic incidents. There are a lot of questions to be asked. All of these reports are questionable only because of that. We don't know whether people are reporting more, and we also don't know, maybe the media is using these cases to talk more about anti-Semitism. The only thing that actually works in favor of the theory that anti-Semitism is on the rise is the fact that there are indisputable anti-Semitic incidents that are happening,
yes,
such as shootings, such as incidents of attacks. These ones we can quantify. And this is why we are saying that anti-Semitism is on the rise. This is why this theory is something that we incline to believe and to attend to. I hope it gave you some kind of... It's not an answer because you didn't have a question, you had a different thesis. Yes.
The main problem is, for example, about the police forces in Central Europe.
Yeah.
They don't monitor verbal attacks on
Yes.
Jews. This is the main problem. They only monitor physical attacks.
Right.
Yes.
And now you have the disproportion. If somebody is talking or typing something under the news that it is highly anti-Semitic, they don't even report it.
Yes.
I feel like one of my students now, I can Google everything. FBI statistics show a sharp increase for the past 4 years of anti-Semitic violent incidences. The ADL is reporting similar instances. CST, the French institutions that keep track of anti-Semitic violent acts, all see increases. Barry Cosman, studying anti-Semitism, racism, and sexism on campuses in American and British universities, sees increases. So there's something happening. And I would say also with the backdrop of what David was speaking about, with the rise of populism, the attack on the center by political Islam, by the extreme left, by the extreme right, using old anti-Semitic canards rooted in the protocols of the elders of Zion. That these are significant issues. So the marginality of groups, the rise of populism, these are all the discourse of society, the rise of Donald Trump and other populists. The discourse is shifting as well as the incidences. Violent acts by white supremacists is reality. These are real things. French Jews, Belgian Jews leaving Europe to go to other places is reality. Is it because of perceived fear? I think the instances of violent acts also, and the changing discourse also backs up people's willingness to leave their homes and move to other countries.
About the social media, there is a close circle of trolls, as I tend to define them, like emotional hackers, who are the main force of anti-Semitic hate speech. Then alternative medias, conspiracy funded by Russian or by Kremlin. And the last but not least, public figures like politicians who are permanently commenting anti-Semitic hate speech towards right now the changing situation of our political, not system, but political future, because they were defeated. And I believe their intensity will be getting more and more because they stay in the opposition, and some of them already behind the parliamentary gate. So this is the crucial. And social media became the main trigger for them or playground.
We got any questions about Islamophobia, right? Was there a question today before?
Go ahead.
All right,
David,
so Islamophobia is somewhat treated differently than anti-Semitism because, well, there is a very interesting research by Professor Amik al-Nahmani, who has wrote a book in Manchester, I think, and his book is exactly about Islamophobia, the way it is presented today in Europe, in a very similar way as anti-Semitism in different times. His research is a very good comparative research. I would read that book for this answer. On my part, I would say that Islamophobia is actually a bit different because it actually depends on the way Muslims are viewed within a certain space. People who do not know Muslims at all are rarely Islamophobic, and people who do not know Jews at all are very Islamophobic. And here I will answer to your very good comment. Thank you for that. I am using the Saudi example only to show that even the Wahhabi Saudis today are actually opposing the Muslim Brotherhood political Islam due to their own, of course, political reasons, and the timing is very important. I'm sorry that 20 minutes is a very short time to elaborate on that one and on many other points that you might now note to me, and you will be right, because as you understand, I can say this much. But the Saudis are doing an amazing thing right now. They are changing the discourse for the whole Arab world, which is Sunni Arab world, which is rare, which is something that we have never viewed as possible before. And this actually happens after, and here you will not like me for saying that, I'm not for Netanyahu, but it actually happens after a decade of diplomatic relations between Netanyahu and the Saudis, which means a lot. It changes the discourse in the Arab world, it changes the paradigms that are related to all this that is actually happening in the Middle East right now. Thank you.
If I'm going to respond to the question of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia regarding Saudi Arabia, I wouldn't give credit to Benjamin Netanyahu. I think that the kingdom did a security survey about 2 years ago now, and they gave themselves 5 years of stability before the kingdom could potentially fall to the Muslim Brotherhood or to Iran, and I think they're desperately seeking allies. That's my reading of the situation.
That's a great to disagree.
Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, I think if you look at Matthias Kunzel's work and Qaradawi's work, the term Islamophobia was created by and supported by the Iranian revolutionary regime. It's a term that's being used to squash criticism of Islam and political Islam. I don't like the term. I prefer discrimination against Muslims, which is a very important issue around the world. And I don't like the comparison. I think anti-Semitism is unique in the sense that it's inherently genocidal. It has a certain pedigree, particularly in Europe. And I think that to collapse the two concepts is problematic, even though the concepts themselves are also problematic. There's all kinds of contradictions in them. And I'll just go, so David, and then I'll respond to Israel Bashar's question.
Okay, Netanyahu, I think it's very interesting that for the last, 10 or 15 years, people have been raising Netanyahu as a kind of unique evil on the planet, and they're still doing it, and they haven't noticed that, our Prime Minister or the President of the United States or many of the European Union leaders are very, very similar politically and in their kind of rhetoric about the liberal elite and the judges and the whole lot of it. So it's actually quite interesting from that point of view that Netanyahu is still treated as a kind of unique evil, even when we have very similar politics in other places. Islamophobia, goodness me, there's a lot to say about Islamophobia. I'm worried to hear Charles say that to focus on the word, really, because it seems to me that a lot of words that we use are problematic. Holocaust is problematic because it implies that there is some benefit out of the sacrifice, and Shoah is a religious word, and anti-Semitism itself was invented by antisemites to express the new rational form of anti-Semitism and the rest of it. So I wouldn't put too much in the word itself. And I'm also worried specifically about the kind of the cry that Muslims cry Islamophobia in order to shut down criticism of Islam, because it's so similar to one of the standard ways of devaluing and not listening to Jews who speak out about anti-Semitism. And we've heard a bit of that in this room too, that Jews say there's a problem with anti-Semitism, and they say that the leader of the opposition himself was leading a movement which bought into all sorts of anti-Semitic movement politics. And then we have people who say, oh, no, the Jews are just imagining it. The Jews are just paranoid. And of course, from paranoia comes the next step, which is conspiracy, that the Jews are inventing this anti-Semitism for their own reasons in order to try to silence criticism of Israel. And so I'm worried about that kind of instrumental
David, can I push you
critique
back to the original question, which was, is Bibi similar to a populist or not?
I think I answered that, didn't I?
You said unique evil, which is...
No.
Okay.
I did answer that, and my answer was yes, that I think Netanyahu is very similar in many ways politically to Trump and to Johnson and to some of the other populist leaders.
And where does the unique evil come from?
No, the point about the unique evil is that, excuse me, the point about the unique evil is that many people around me in the labour movement, in the trade unions, in the Labour Party, in academia, they still treat Netanyahu as a unique evil. And they still treat Israel as a kind of unique focus for all that is bad in the world, even when it's clearer than ever that it isn't. That was my point.
But that wasn't my question.
I know, I think I answered your question.
I wasn't referring...
No, I understand that.
Okay.
No, I understand.
So just, I don't know, a few more things about Islamophobia. I think Islamophobia is real. I think that one of the key photographs for Brexit was this image about how the European Union was going to bring in all these brown and foreign people who don't share our values and who don't like us and who will disrupt us and all the rest of it. And I think that this kind of image was very important. And I do think that you know, it's quite hard to be Muslim in Britain or America at the moment. So we can argue about the word itself, but the phenomenon, I think, is real. How similar is it to anti-Semitism? And again, we're into a whole kind of hill of beans here, because in some ways there are similarities, and I think we should study anti-Semitism alongside the study of racism and alongside the study of Islamophobia and alongside the study of other bigotries. They're in the same kind of universe, but of course nothing is unique. And anti-Semitism, I mean everything is unique. If you ask me, you know, is this similar to that? And the answer is, well, everything is similar in some ways and everything is unique in other ways. And the apparently unique features of anti-Semitism are very interesting, one of which I think is its evolution as a way of emotionally visualizing the hatred of the liberal elite and the establishment and the democratic state. And of course, I mean, I could go on and on, as you know, but to 30 seconds. This was the shooter in Pittsburgh. And the shooter went to the synagogue in Pittsburgh to murder Jews because he believed that the Jews were bringing in foreigners. Again, the similar kind of idea to the Nigel Farage poster. The Jews and the liberal elite who they control are bringing in foreigners to dilute our culture. So you know, again, back to David Goodhart. Well, of course, there's nothing inherently xenophobic about liking to be amongst your own people in some sense, but sometimes there is. And when there is racism and Islamophobia, there's also anti-Semitism, generally, because they, another...
So, we have no more time for questions, just to respond to the Israel bashing question. And to David, I think words are very important to understand where the term Islamophobia comes from and the politics behind it and to unpack it. is really important. So I have a problem with the term. Having said that, if we use the term as imperfect as it is, and anti-Semitism is also an imperfect term as well, and I agree with you, there's very serious issues of discrimination against Muslims in Europe, and it's increasing, and it's becoming, I think the whole notion of citizenship in the West, in Europe and North America is a very important issue to take seriously. Regarding Israel bashing, in our survey, in our study of 10,000 Europeans, you could be critical of Israel without being anti-Semitic, so that's not an issue. So you can be critical of Israel or critical of Netanyahu, and not necessarily, as David was saying, be anti-Semitic. But there's a fine line. And then I'd also like to end. I was at the United Nations last week. I addressed 400 Muslim leaders. And I was speaking about how the focus on Israel and on Zionism and on Netanyahu is a form of anti-Semitism. And this focus on the Zionist entity, while we have 700,000 refugees in Syria alone since December, and the genocide, if I may use that word, continues. The displacement of 15 million people, and people are focusing on Netanyahu and Israel, that's a problematic matter. And with the borders, I'm also thinking that image that the Brexiters used is very problematic. At the same time, if we go deeper, we have Erdogan, who's now the heir apparent to the Muslim Brotherhood, who's extorting Europe over refugees. So we have all sorts of populism, all sorts of displacement, all sorts of marginality. And unfortunately, or fortunately for our research center, I think these issues are going to be around for a while and deserve serious interdisciplinary analysis. And I think that's what we're all here for. And I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.